10:17 a.m., Wall Street. The marble floors of Empire National Bank reflected everything except warmth. Men in tailored suits moved with practiced speed. Phones buzzed, tickers scrolled. Money was already awake, already working. Julian Thorne stood at the counter, hands relaxed at his sides, holding a check worth $250,000. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look impressed either. "Deposit," he said calmly, sliding the check across the polished surface. The teller glanced down, then up. Her eyes paused for half a second too long. She didn't smile. She stood and walked toward the glass office behind the counter. Julian waited. Behind the glass sat Silas Vane, branch manager, 55, gray at the temples, cufflinks that caught the light when he moved. A man who had spent decades believing he could identify risk at a glance. Silas read the check once, then again. He looked up at Julian for the first time. "This is a large amount," Silas said, stepping out of the office. His tone was polite, measured, professional. "May I ask where this came from?" "It's a grant," Julian replied, "issued this morning." Silas nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already believed. "We'll need to verify it." "Of course," Julian said. Silas studied him. The sneakers, the simple jacket. No watch he recognized. No signals he respected. "This institution has very strict security standards," Silas said. "We've seen an increase in sophisticated forgeries." Julian didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. The silence made Silas uncomfortable. Silas turned to the teller. "Initiate a security hold." The word hold landed heavier than it sounded. Two customers nearby looked up. One man leaned slightly to get a better view. A woman pretended not to stare and failed. Julian felt it. Then not fear, not shock, but something familiar. That quiet tightening in the chest that comes when you realize the rules have shifted without your consent. "Is there a problem?" Julian asked. Silas smiled thinly. "Just procedure." Silas stepped back toward his office. Inside, he pressed a button beneath his desk. The call went out quietly. "NYPD. Non-emergency. Suspicious financial instrument." The clock above the counter ticked forward. 10:18. Julian exhaled once and looked around. Cameras in the ceiling. Reflections in the glass. Phones already angled in his direction. He raised his wrist, casual, almost invisible. The smartwatch lit up for a moment. One tap, then another. A message sent. A protocol activated. No one noticed. Silas returned, folding his hands in front of him. "For your protection," he said, "we'll need you to remain here." Julian met his eyes. "Am I being detained?" Silas didn't answer directly. "Let's just say it's better if you cooperate." The word cooperate hung in the air. A uniformed security guard appeared near the door. Then another. 10:19. The first police officer walked in. Veteran. Calm. Took in the room with a practiced scan. "What's the situation?" he asked. Silas stepped forward, quickly, relieved. "Possible forged check. High value. Client unable to provide sufficient verification." The officer turned to Julian. "Sir, I need you to come with us." Julian nodded once. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," the officer said. "But we need to ask some questions." The guard reached gently for Julian's arm. A woman near the window gasped when the handcuffs clicked shut. The sound was sharp, final. Someone whispered, "That's messed up." Someone else said nothing. Julian felt the cold metal settle around his wrists. He stayed upright, calm, silent. Silas watched, arms crossed, convinced he had done his job. Then the doors opened again. Not hurried, not dramatic, just controlled. A woman entered the bank flanked by two aides. She wore a dark coat perfectly tailored. Her presence shifted the room without a word being spoken. The officer stiffened. Silas frowned. "Ma'am, this is a restricted situation." She handed him a folder. "Eleanor Thorne," she said evenly, "Chair of the Federal Banking Oversight Committee." The room went still. Silas's smile vanished. The officer looked at the name, then at Julian, then back at Eleanor. "I'm here regarding an audit," Eleanor continued. "Triggered at 10:18 a.m. She turned to her son. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she said quietly. The handcuffs came off. The clock kept ticking. Julian had already made his decision before the first officer finished speaking. Not because he was fearless, not because he trusted the room, but because he had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly only fed the wrong narrative. Anger made things louder, not clearer. And clarity was the only thing that ever changed outcomes. He stood where they had left him, wrists free now, but still marked by the moment, the faint pressure lingering like a memory. The bank resumed a cautious version of movement. Whispers, sideways glances, the soft shuffle of shoes that wanted to pretend nothing significant had happened. Julian didn't pretend. He watched. Silas Vane was speaking to one of the officers in a lowered voice, his posture stiff, his confidence dented, but not gone. Men like Silas didn't collapse when challenged. They recalibrated. They searched for procedural cover, for language that could turn judgment into policy. Julian knew the type. He had studied them not in books, but in rooms like this one. Conference rooms, hearing rooms, places where decisions were made without raising voices. His mother had taught him that silence was not weakness. Silence was data collection. He remembered being 16, sitting quietly at the end of a long dining table while adults debated a merger. One executive had laughed when Julian asked a simple question about risk exposure. Eleanor had said nothing in the moment. Later in the car, she told him, "Never interrupt someone when they're revealing how they think." That lesson was why he stood still now. Inside, his watch systems were already moving. Compliance alerts had been triggered. Digital logs locked. Every keystroke, every internal message from the last 20 minutes preserved. No edits. No quiet cleanups. No rewriting history after the fact. This wasn't retaliation. It was process. Julian didn't look at his watch again. He didn't need to. The branch had entered a different mode, though most people didn't realize it yet. The air had shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The tellers avoided eye contact, unsure of what rules applied now. Silas turned and finally addressed Julian directly. "Let's step into my office," he said, forcing a courteous tone. "Clear this up privately." Julian met his gaze. "I'm fine where I am." Silas tightened his jaw. "This doesn't need to be escalated." Julian nodded slightly. "It already is." That unsettled Silas more than raised voices ever could. A younger employee stood near the printers, frozen eyes darting between them. Julian noticed her hesitation. He had seen it before people who sensed something was wrong, but didn't yet feel safe naming it. He didn't blame her. Systems train silence better than honesty. The officers conferred quietly. One checked his radio. Another glanced at the folder Eleanor had brought, still sitting unopened on the counter. Silas watched them, then looked back at Julian. "You need to understand," he said, lowering his voice. "We're responsible for protecting clients. Julian answered evenly. So am I. That stopped Silas again. Protecting clients. Protecting institutions. Protecting the image of control. The words were always the same. Julian had learned to listen for what wasn't said. What Silas meant was that people like Julian didn't fit the pattern he trusted. That patterns were easier than individuals. That assumptions saved time. Julian shifted his weight slightly, not from discomfort, but from awareness. The room was no longer about him. It was about what the room revealed. He caught fragments of conversation behind him. This is going to be a problem. Why were the cops even called? Isn't that kid somebody? The word kid echoed. Julian didn't correct it. He had learned that titles didn't matter until systems were forced to acknowledge them. Eleanor stood a few feet away, saying nothing. She didn't step in. She didn't rescue. That was deliberate. This wasn't her moment. It was the system's. Julian knew she was watching Silas not with anger, but with focus. She was measuring the gap between policy and practice, between intention and outcome. She had always believed that gaps were where reform began. Silas straightened his tie. We can still handle this internally. Eleanor finally spoke her voice, calm, almost conversational. That decision was taken out of your hands when the call was made. Silas looked at her, then back at Julian, then at the officers. The room no longer belonged to him. Julian felt the weight of that realization ripple outward. He thought of the people who never got this moment, who were escorted out without explanation, who were told to come back later, who were denied loans with polite smiles and vague language, people who didn't have a protocol to activate or a name that carried weight. That was why he had agreed to do this in the first place, not to prove he belonged, but to document who was kept out. The officer nearest the counter cleared his throat. We're going to need to file a report. Eleanor nodded. Of course. Silas exhaled sharply. This is excessive. Julian looked at him, not with anger, with something closer to disappointment. Excessive is assuming intent without evidence, Julian said. This is documentation. Silas opened his mouth, then closed it. The clock above the counter read 10:31. 14 minutes. That was all it had taken for control to change hands not through force, but through record. Julian felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Not because the situation was over, but because it was finally honest. He caught Eleanor's eye for a brief moment. She gave the smallest nod. Not approval. Confirmation. The quiet decision had already done its work. Authority doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it enters a room the way pressure changes before a storm, quietly, unmistakably. When Eleanor Thorne stood near the counter, the bank didn't know what to do with her. There was no protocol for a presence like hers that didn't ask permission, didn't demand attention, and didn't need to explain itself. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't assert rank. She simply occupied space with certainty. Silas Vane felt it immediately. He had dealt with regulators before, auditors, consultants, people who carried titles, but still deferred to the rhythms of the branch. Eleanor didn't move like them. She didn't look around for validation. She looked around to assess. The officers shifted their weight, suddenly aware that the room had changed hands again. One of them glanced at Eleanor, then at Julian, then at the folder she had placed on the counter. No one touched it. Not yet. Silas cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, forcing courtesy back into his voice. We were in the middle of resolving a situation. Eleanor nodded once. "I'm aware." Her eyes moved briefly to Julian, not to check on him, not to reassure, but to confirm something only the two of them understood. He stood straight, composed exactly where he needed to be. Silas gestured vaguely toward the officers. This is an internal matter, a routine security concern. Eleanor turned to face him fully for the first time. Routine, she repeated, testing the word. You called law enforcement. Silas bristled, out of an abundance of caution. Caution is documented, Eleanor replied evenly. Assumptions are not. The distinction landed harder than an accusation. The older officer stepped forward. Ma'am, just so we're clear, are you representing the client? Eleanor met his gaze. I'm here to represent the system. That answer gave him pause. Silas straightened his tie again. With respect, this branch operates under federal oversight. Eleanor finished for him. Yes. The room was quiet enough now that the hum of the lights felt loud. Eleanor opened the folder. Not dramatically, methodically. Inside were documents stamped and dated the kind that didn't ask questions but expected answers. This branch was selected for review 6 weeks ago, she said, sliding a page across the counter. Today's events accelerated the timeline. Silas stared at the paper. His confidence flickered, not gone, but searching for footing. This is highly irregular, he said. No, Eleanor replied. What's irregular is that it took this long. Silas looked at Julian, then really looked at him. Not as a customer, not as a suspect. As a variable he had misjudged. Julian didn't meet his stare. He didn't need to. One of the tellers swallowed hard. Another employee stepped back, as if distance might absolve her from what she had witnessed. The younger woman by the printers looked down at her shoes, then up again, her expression unsettled. Silas lowered his voice. You have to understand, I was acting in the best interest of the bank. Eleanor closed the folder. Banks don't have interests, she said. They have responsibilities. Silas opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time since the morning began, he wasn't sure which words would protect him. The officer cleared his throat again. So how do you want to proceed? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She took in the room, the cameras, the counters, the people who had paused their lives to watch this unfold. She understood optics as well as anyone, but she wasn't here for performance. By the book, she said at last. Julian felt something settle then. Not relief. Alignment. Silas's shoulders sagged just slightly. Not defeat, but the beginning of recognition. He had built his authority on instinct, on reading rooms, on deciding who fit. Now he was standing in a room that no longer responded to his cues. This could damage the branch, he said quietly. Eleanor's tone didn't change. Then the branch should have protected itself better. Julian finally spoke again, his voice steady. No one's asking for special treatment. Silas looked at him sharply. Julian continued. Just equal application of the rules. That was the moment Silas understood what had happened. Not that a powerful woman had walked in. Not that the police had been called. But that the narrative he relied on controlled discretion judgment had been replaced by something he couldn't bend. Process. Eleanor turned to the officers. Thank you for responding. You're free to file your report. The older officer nodded, his posture respectful now. Yes, ma'am. As they stepped back, the room exhaled. Silas stood alone at the counter, the center of attention he had never wanted. He looked smaller, somehow, not diminished, but exposed. Eleanor addressed him one last time. This isn't personal, she said, but it is consequential. She turned away, then her role complete for the moment. Julian watched Silas process the shift, the realization that authority wasn't something you held forever. It was something the system allowed until it didn't. The clock read 10:46. The morning was far from over, but the balance had changed. The trial didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in conference rooms, compliance dashboards, and quiet calls that started with, "We need to talk about what happened this morning." By noon, the branch on Wall Street was no longer the center of the story. It was the first data point. Silas Vane sat alone in his office, the glass walls no longer a symbol of authority, but exposure. Every surface around him reflected something he hadn't anticipated scrutiny. Not outrage, not accusation. Scrutiny was worse. It was patient. It didn't blink. Across town, in a building designed for decisions rather than transactions, the system began to turn on itself. Julian stood at the end of a long table sleeves, rolled once tablet in front of him. He wasn't presenting as a victim. He was presenting as a witness. That distinction mattered. "This is not a personal complaint," he said to the room. "It's a pattern review." Screens lit up one by one. Loan denials, escalations, security flags, all filtered through a single branch, a single approval chain, a single manager's discretion. Silas's name appeared more often than anyone expected. One board member leaned back in his chair. "Correlation doesn't imply intent." Julian nodded. "Agreed." He tapped the screen again. "But it does imply responsibility." The data wasn't emotional. It didn't raise its voice. It didn't accuse. It simply showed that certain applicants, by zip code, by business size, by profile, were stopped more often, questioned, longer declined, at higher rates, always with language that sounded reasonable, always defensible in isolation, never neutral in aggregate. Eleanor watched from the side of the room, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. She had insisted Julian lead this portion, not because he needed to prove himself, but because the system needed to see who had been paying attention all along. A second board member spoke up. "Are we sure this isn't overcorrection? We don't want to criminalize caution." Eleanor stepped forward, then her voice calm but firm. "No one is on trial for being cautious," she said. "The system is on trial for being consistent." That landed. Silas was brought in halfway through the session, not escorted, not humiliated, just invited to sit and listen. He did. At first, his posture was defensive, arms crossed, jaw tight. He watched the screens with the practiced skepticism of a man who had always trusted his instincts more than spreadsheets. But instincts don't argue back. Data does. He recognized the applications, the names, the moments when he had told himself he was protecting the bank, when he had believed genuinely that he was doing the right thing. Julian's voice remained steady. "These decisions were never flagged internally," he said, "because each one followed protocol. The issue isn't deviation, it's accumulation." Silas shifted in his chair. A woman from compliance cleared her throat. "This suggests a structural blind spot." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly." She turned to Silas. "Do you remember your first year managing this branch?" He hesitated. "Of course. What were you taught to look for?" Silas swallowed. "Risk." "And how did you define it?" Silas opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he heard his own thinking from the outside. "I looked for patterns," he said quietly. Julian didn't interrupt. Eleanor pressed gently. "Whose patterns?" Silas stared at the table. "The ones I was shown." That admission didn't absolve him, but it contextualized him. This wasn't about a villain. It was about inheritance. A board member leaned forward. "So what's the recommendation?" Julian answered before Eleanor could. "Remove discretionary escalation without secondary review," he said. "Mandate transparency in security holds. Implement external audits on denial patterns, and retrain staff on bias not as a moral failure, but as a systems issue." The room was silent. "That's a lot," someone said. Julian met his gaze. "So is rebuilding trust?" Silas finally spoke again. "I never meant to." Julian looked at him then. Not with anger, not with triumph. "I know," he said. "That's the problem." The words hit harder than any accusation. Silas exhaled slowly. 20 years of certainty drained out of him in that moment. Not because he was exposed, but because he understood. The system had rewarded him for instincts that no longer served anyone but itself. Eleanor closed the meeting. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about correction. But correction requires accountability." Silas nodded once. "I understand." Later alone, again in his office, Silas removed his cufflinks and set them on the desk. He stared at them for a long time. They had always made him feel established, respected. Now they felt like artifacts. Across the city, Julian stood by a window, watching the traffic move below. He felt no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve. He thought of the people behind the numbers, the ones who never got a meeting, the ones who were told no with a smile and a brochure, the ones who blamed themselves. This wasn't about winning. It was about making sure the next person didn't need a protocol to be treated fairly. Eleanor joined him at the window. "You did well," she said. Julian nodded. "It shouldn't take this much." She looked at him. "That's why it does." The system had been put on trial. And for once, it couldn't look away. The branch reopened on a Monday morning without ceremony. No banners, no press. Just new signage behind the glass that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. The words were simple: Community Wealth Center. Smaller font beneath it explained what that meant: financial access, transparent lending advisory hours, open to first-time applicants. The marble floors were still there. So were the suits. But something in the building felt different. Less guarded. Less certain of who belonged. Julian walked in quietly this time, without a check in his hand. No one stopped him. No one stared. A few employees recognized him and straightened, unsure whether to speak. He nodded politely and kept moving. Near the far counter, a man in his 40s sat, with a loan officer, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on a spreadsheet. Julian recognized him from the data. A contractor from Queens. 3 prior applications. 3 polite denials. Today the conversation sounded different, slower, more deliberate, less rushed toward no. That was the point. Silas Vane was no longer in the corner office. His nameplate had been removed, not erased, archived. The decision hadn't been dramatic. No escort, no headlines, just a formal reassignment pending review, followed by a recommendation to retire early. When Silas packed his things, he didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, as if accepting a truth he had spent years avoiding. His last day passed without confrontation. The branch barely noticed him leave. That hurt more than any reprimand. Weeks later, Julian stood with Eleanor on the steps across from the New York Stock Exchange. Traffic moved around them, indifferent as ever. The city had already absorbed the story and moved on to the next outrage, the next headline. Eleanor liked it that way. "You didn't push for charges," Julian said. "No," she replied. "You could have." "Yes." He waited, knowing she would finish when she was ready. Punishment satisfies the moment, Eleanor said. Reform survives it. Julian watched a group of younger professionals pass by, laughing, unaware of how fragile access still was. He thought of the officers who had done their jobs without malice, of the teller who had looked away, of the woman by the printers who had wanted to speak but didn't know how. "Do you think it worked?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question. "It's working," she said. "That's different." Later that afternoon, Julian sat in on a mentoring session at the branch. A dozen people from different backgrounds, different ages, all trying to understand a system that had never been designed to explain itself to them. He didn't lecture. He listened. One woman spoke about her parents losing their savings in the early 2000s and never trusting a bank again. A man admitted he'd been running his business in cash for years because he assumed he'd be rejected anyway. A young employee asked how to speak up without risking her job. Julian answered honestly. "You don't fix a system by pretending it's evil," he said. "You fix it by refusing to let it stay invisible." Eleanor watched from the back of the room. This was the outcome she cared about. Not vindication, continuity. That evening, Julian found a message waiting on his phone. A short note from Silas. "I've been thinking about what you said. I didn't mean to do harm, but I see now that I did." Julian read it twice. He didn't respond right away. He thought about legacy, not as inheritance, but as direction. About what it meant to leave something better without needing to be thanked for it. He typed a brief reply. Acknowledging impact matters more than intent. "I hope you use what you've learned." Silas replied a few minutes later. "I plan to." Julian put the phone down. The next quarterly report showed early shifts. Approval timelines shortened. Appeals increased and succeeded. Complaints dropped, not because people had stopped speaking up, but because they were being heard sooner. No one called it a revolution. That was intentional. Eleanor reviewed the numbers late one night, glasses low on her nose, the way she always did when she was thinking. Julian sat across from her, scrolling through feedback surveys. "They'll say this was easy for us," he said. "They always do," Eleanor replied. "People confuse access with ease." He nodded. "They'll say we only cared because it happened to us." Eleanor closed the folder. "Then we'll keep caring after they stop paying attention." Julian smiled faintly. "You taught me that." She looked at him softer now. "No, you practiced it." Outside, the city moved on. Inside the system, small things continued to change. Training manuals rewritten, metrics reweighted, language adjusted. Doors opened a little wider, not out of charity, but out of obligation. That was the legacy. Not revenge, not exposure, not a moment frozen in outrage, but a process that didn't need a name to function. Julian returned to the branch one last time before stepping away from the initiative. As he left, the young employee who had once stood frozen by the printers caught up to him. "I wanted to say, thank you," she said. "I didn't know how to speak up before." Julian shook his head. "You do now." She nodded, standing a little taller. Outside, the doors closed behind him, not as a barrier, but as a boundary that no longer decided worth at a glance. Power hadn't been destroyed. It had been redirected. And that Julian knew was the only kind of ending that lasted. This story began with a moment that felt small on the surface. A young man standing at a bank counter, a check in his hand, a decision made about him in seconds. But as the story unfolded, it became clear that what happened to Julian Thorne was never just about one transaction, one manager, or one morning on Wall Street. It was about how modern systems operate when they believe no one is truly watching, and what happens when that belief is challenged. Julian did everything the way he was told to do it. He followed the rules. He spoke calmly. He trusted that professionalism would be met with professionalism. When that trust was broken, he didn't respond with outrage or defiance. Instead, he responded with patience, preparation, and an understanding that systems reveal their true nature under pressure. His power was not in who he was connected to, but in how he chose to act when the system failed him. Silas Vane, the bank manager, represents a truth that is harder to accept than the idea of an obvious villain. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't shouting slurs or breaking laws in visible ways. He believed he was doing his job. He believed his instincts were neutral, shaped by experience, and rewarded by years of approval. That belief is precisely what made him dangerous. His story reminds us that harm is often caused not by bad people, but by comfortable people who stop questioning their own judgment. Eleanor Thorne's role was never about rescuing her son. She didn't storm in to demand apologies or dominate the room with emotion. She arrived with process documentation and restraint. She understood that humiliation creates headlines, but accountability creates change. Her authority came from preparation and moral clarity, not volume. In doing so, she modeled a different kind of power, one that corrects systems rather than crushing individuals. By the end of the story, no one won in the traditional sense. There was no viral meltdown, no dramatic arrest, no public shaming. Instead, something far more meaningful happened. Policies were rewritten. Oversight was strengthened. A branch changed how it measured risk access and responsibility. People who had been quietly excluded were finally seen. That is what lasting change looks like: quiet, procedural, and deeply uncomfortable for those who benefit from the status quo. The deeper lesson of this story is that injustice today rarely announces itself loudly. It hides behind polite language, standard procedures, and well-meaning explanations. It survives because it feels normal. And that is why it's so easy to participate in without realizing it. Systems don't need hatred to harm people. They only need habits that go unexamined. So what does this mean for us here and now? First, it reminds us to slow down before we react. Julian's restraint was not passivity, it was strategy. In our own lives, especially in moments of conflict or misunderstanding, reacting emotionally can feel satisfying, but it often reinforces the very dynamics we want to change. Pausing allows us to choose a response that creates leverage rather than noise. Second, it challenges us to look beyond intent and examine outcomes. Many of us take pride in having good intentions, but intention alone does not protect others from harm. Whether you're leading a team, managing a business, or influencing a household, it's worth asking who benefits from how things are currently done, who is consistently questioned, delayed, or dismissed. Patterns tell the truth that individual moments often hide. Third, the story encourages us to speak up when we have cover. Eleanor didn't wait until public outrage made action unavoidable. She acted because she understood her responsibility. In our own context, there are moments when we have more influence than we think. Moments when our voice, our position, or even our willingness to ask an uncomfortable question can shift the direction of a decision. Silence is often easier, but it is never neutral. Finally, the story reframes what legacy really means. Legacy is not about proving someone wrong or winning a confrontation. It's about leaving behind systems that function better for people you may never meet. It's about making fairness the default rather than the exception. That kind of legacy doesn't trend online, but it changes lives quietly and permanently. If this story made you reflect on power fairness or your own role within the systems you move through every day, then you're not alone, and you're exactly who this channel is for. Stories like this exist to challenge, to clarify, and to remind us that dignity should never depend on appearance assumptions or access to influence. If you want to see more stories that explore real-world moral tension, quiet power, and meaningful change, please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating thoughtful, high-quality content that goes deeper than surface-level drama. Thank you for watching, for thinking, and for being part of a community that believes stories can still move us towards something better.